What's going on, my little code minions? We're here with another episode of Conquering the JavaScript interview, where I'm following up the last video in this playlist talking about another data structure. Up until that point, we've been talking about algorithms, and now we're talking a little bit about data structures to chill things out. Again, these, like I mentioned in that last video, and not to sound too much like a broken record, the point of data structures is less so knowing how to code them, especially for like a technical interview where you're having a discussion with, well, your interviewer. Well, at least that's how I hope who you're discussing with. Don't be having a discussion with some random person off on the side in your interview. Bad idea. Talk to the interviewer. But jokes aside, this is more about having a conversation with your interviewer and knowing the differences between these kinds of data structures. Last video, we had a stack data structure where I talked about with my food service and retail baratna that we discussed LIFO and FIFO, right? So just like in that video, it's the same thing here in a queue. Think of it like a queue at a bank. The first person up in that queue of people at the bank going and talking to the teller, maybe to withdraw money or do whatever, they're the first one served, and the last one coming in will be the last one served, right? So it follows a first in, first out system rather than the last in, last out system. Is that even right? That sounds correct. I get these confused sometimes, even though I worked in it there. Yeah, it follows the first in, first out principle. Okay, just double checking my terminology and make sure I'm not losing my mind. So the stack was LIFO, queue is FIFO. First in, first out, right? So just like in that data structure video, we're going to have several requirements for our queue here. And yeah, technically you could just have an array and use something like the shift array method to handle this, but we're going to make us implement it here code-wise as a class object in JavaScript. And it's going to have several methods or getter properties, whatever you want to use. We have the most important two will be the enqueue and the dequeue methods, right? So inserting a new element at the end of the queue, unlike where it was like the stack of plates analogy in the stack video, right? We are going to enqueue our element, whether it's a person, a name, a number, whatever we want to enqueue. It needs to be at the end of the queue, right? And that's called enqueuing an element. And I know I'm going to say this word and type this word so many times, I'm going to lose my mind and typo all over the place. But bear with me while I deal with that. Then we have the other important method called the dequeue method, means we remove an element from the front of the queue, which is dequeuing, right? Because the person at the front of the line has been helped, they're done, they got their withdrawal, they got out of the line, and then the line shifts upward, right? This is going to be actually a fair bit more cheeky to figure out than the simplicity of using an array and array methods back in the previous video for stack, which again will be in the description below. We have the classic peek method, which is the same thing we had in the stack data structure, where we're going to be looking at the element at the front without modifying the queue. We'll have an array method, or not an array method, a method to get its length, and a method check it's empty. If we want, we can do one for, I think I had print stacks, we can do one for print queue or something like that. Doesn't matter. So again, just like this is a fairly straightforward data structure, and we're going to take a look at the code, and we're going to focus on, obviously we're going to write it and figure it out and solve it. The likelihood of you having to write stack and data queue code in a technical interview, even for an entry-level position, probably not going to happen. If it does, get in the comments below. Get in the comments. Tell me I'm wrong. But more than likely, you could have theoretically this discussion of these data structures, kind of like testing your knowledge, seeing what kind of fundamentals you're working with, and if you can even reason through them if you're not fairly familiar. But that's what we're here for. I'm familiarizing you with stuff my students and myself have gone through, and just general knowledge that I kind of encountered through, well, subreddit, Stack Overflow, Medium articles, whatever, right? So here we go. Let's actually start coding this sucker here. I'm going to zoom in one layer more and move this over so we can take a look at more code, and I'll come back over. Actually, I should run this. And just like I learned in my other videos, I need to turn off autosave, which I'll inevitably forget to turn back on in the next video I record. Cool. So here we go. In the queue class data structure, obviously in our class-based coding, we're going to have our constructor method, and we're going to have a couple properties when instantiating a new queue. So unlike the stack method or stack data structure, where I just utilized an array and called it a day, we're going to have to measure. We're not going to be using like our shifting indexes of an array to get this solved and figured out here. I actually need to have an object to track the first in, first out structure and keeping that value going, right? So like I'm not going to be using shifting index arrays because that's going to be confusing to keep up with. I need to instead use an object, which will be more evident why here in just a moment. Now, this value here, we can call it the front the head of the queue, the front index, the front, whatever you want to call it. At the moment, when we instantiate a new queue class, we're going to start it at 0 because there is nothing at the front of the queue by default. And we're going to enqueue things as time moves on. Just like we have to know where the front of the line is, we need to know what the back of the line is. So we're going to have a this.rear index, ending index, tail, another common one. You'll see head and tail a lot. I like front and rear because that makes sense to me, considering I'm thinking about this as a line at a bank rather than a stack of dishes. And I take the top of the stack off and work my way down, right? So here we have our 3 core properties of our queue data structure. The elements, where we're going to contain this whole thing, and then the properties of front and rear that will tell us how long it is for our length property to bet down the line, and it will handle our logic of handling first in, first out. Okay? So, with our queue we have going on now, right? We need to now have our first method, which is enqueuing an element into this queue class. So we're going to have enqueue, looks right, and we'll call it, since I called it this.elements or this.line or whatever you want to call it, this.queue, we'll say whatever element we pass into enqueue to be consistent with this up here. We'll call it an element. Who cares? We can call it pizza. It's an argument name. It doesn't matter what we call it. But element makes sense since we're collecting an array or an object of elements. Now, we're going to be using the square bracket syntax of objects for my newbies out here. If I haven't covered this in a previous video, I'm going to recover it now. There are 2 ways to handle. Adding new. Oh yeah, you have to have done this because in the string, if you follow this playlist, you've done the string breakdown video, which does use this technique. Yeah, so just as a reminder, this is another valid way of referencing object properties in JavaScript. You do not have to use simple dot notation. The square bracket notation and writing a string value of the property name of the object will give you the value. If it doesn't exist there and you assign it a value, then what's going to end up happening is it creates that property age and assigns it a value of 35. So I'm referencing this right here because it's a dynamic way to find properties inside of objects, because the dot notation, you have to know what the property is, whereas the square bracket syntax lets you get away with not knowing what the property is and letting a variable determine it for you. Why does this matter? Because we're going to reference the elements property of this class, which is an object, and we're going to reference what position in the queue it's going to be. Well, it's going to be wherever the rear position currently is. When first starting out, it's value 0, and we're going to assign whatever element we're adding or enqueuing into this queue, right? We're going to assign it that value at the current back of the line, which is 0 when we first start our queue. Then we also have to say, hey, the back of the line is now 1 position further away, and we're using this little shorthand here because remember, this is an assignment of this.rear equals this.rear plus 1. So we're just going to go ahead and do that right there, right? Like my brain's thinking I have to explain that because I came off that back of a bunch of React videos where state is immutable and you shouldn't do things like this, but I'm getting confused. Okay, so yeah, important parts. Add it to the back of the line. Tell our queue structure, hey, the new back of the line is 1 behind where it started. Okay. Next, our dequeue. This one's going to be a little more complicated. No argument required here because it needs to simply take the first thing in the queue, move it, and then let us know that the line has shifted, right? Because that person at the front of the line has been helped, the first person that got there, and they got out of the way. So what we're going to do is we need to get what the item is. If we want to, like, for example, if we want to return it from this value here, like we need, typically, like in data structures, when you like remove something, it's a good idea to also return what you removed, kind of like the pop method we did in the data structure, in the stack data structure. So it's fairly easy to kind of reverse this logic to remove something or dequeue it, right? So from the first, it has to be from the front of the line. So what we're going to say is delete this.elements wherever the front of the line happens to be. So delete from this.elements, which is an object, the property that references where the front of the line is, right? So whoever in the front of the line happens to be will be 0 on the first person. We'll delete 0, and then after we delete that, we have to say, hey, the front of the line has now moved up this 1 property. That way we know where the line is. So these are going to be number values here as object properties that will be tracking where the front and the back of the line are. That is the big difference here compared to how easy it was in the stack data structure to just use existing array methods. Now, Something else, like I said, it's fairly common to also return something when you like pop it off, or in our case, DQ it. So we need to know what the item is. Before we delete the item, let's go ahead and store it into a variable. So I can say the item is going to be this dot elements at position this dot front. So basically make a copy of that value before we delete it, move the front of the line up, and then we're going to return that item from this method so we can console log it, do stuff with it. I don't know why that just auto-completed that way. Yeah, so we're going to make sure that we are also capable of returning that item from this method if we need to console log it or do something with it, right? Okay. From our other methods, we had what? Peak length and is empty. Okay. So for peaking, we'll say peak is a method that takes no arguments because we simply want to know who the front of the line is. Just like we saw a moment ago, we'll simply return the element at the front of the line as it currently stands. And there you go. From there, now these are two things this is something I didn't mention in the stack data structure video, so we're going to change it up. There's a special keyword for getters here in JavaScript classes and ES6 classes that if we write, for example, get length, this becomes a class property instead of a method, meaning we don't have to invoke the length method on our instantiated Q class. We can simply reference this as a property of the Q class, right? So it's a cool thing to know. I just want to throw that out there for y'all. So what we're going to say is the length of the queue. Now, unlike the stack video, which again I keep referencing, how simple, and again, it'll be in the comments and description below, and in the previous video in this playlist as well, the length method was very easy on that because we simply, called the length method of arrays. Here, it's a bit more complicated, right? We could obviously just do some kind of object looping, like a for in loop on objects and count how many properties there are, maybe even object.keys.length or something like that. But we can also just take what our current queue front and rear position are, subtract the difference, and because we're not doing any kind of array index shenanigans, that'll be the length of our queue. So I can say return the back of the line and subtract where the front of the line happens to be, and that will be our length. Just like with isEmpty, we can do the same thing where we can just simply ask isEmpty as a property of instantiated queue classes to say, hey, return this dot length equals 0. And there you go. There's our comparison. So what am I getting away with here? This dot length is a property of Q classes and not a method. Without that get keyword there, I would have to invoke this dot length as a class method. So this is something else I wanted to throw into y'all's vocabulary, throw something else into y'all's tool belt for these class style coding solutions where you have properties and methods. So I think that's pretty dang cool, right? And I always forget this is the thing because in our course we teach mostly like how to use methods to your advantage and things like that. But you can totally make properties that do calculations for you. So there we go. I think that covers everything we needed to have happen here. So let's actually queue some stuff up and see how this works. I will call my queue the line because that makes sense. We're making a line like at a bank or at a, I don't know, store. It doesn't matter where it is, right? We're going to instantiate a new queue class. There we go, and we have our line ready to go. So let's queue some people up and then begin console logging some values and taking a look at what's going on here. So I'm going to say line and queue. I'll add myself to the front of the line right here. There we go. Coming up behind me will be my wife, Audrey. After that, we'll do an enqueue of my cat, Apollo. And from there, we're going to enqueue my cat, Percival. No mercy, Percy. Okay, so there is our queue forming at the bank that happens to serve cats as well for some reason. So let's take a look at some console log values here to see what's going on. So first things first, let's just look at what the class ends up looking like if I say line.elements, because that's the property. And again, and you can do this, well, it doesn't really matter. We can't really make private properties, so I could theoretically be messing with my elements directly, which is never a good idea, but that's beyond the scope of this video. We're talking about this data structure of queues. Take a look at it here, right? So looking at our console log, I am indeed at the front of the line. We're going to assume this left-hand curly brace is our bank teller, helping the first person in line, which happens to be me. And then Percival came at the end of the line, so that's why he's over there. And you can see our this dot front and is still 0, right? This dot rear, as I've been enqueuing elements, should have been increasing in time, which it has. So as I've been enqueuing people into this line at the bank here, this being the front, this dot rear has indeed been increasing, right? So it's currently a value of 4. Now, I, at the front of the line, am still this dot front of 0, which hasn't changed. So this dot front is still 0, right? So let's take a look if my peek method returns what I expect it to return. So let's change this from line.elements to my peek method and save this file. It indeed has peeked and told me Luke without removing or doing anything. Now, if I call the length, not call, but rather simply do notate the length property here, hopefully that correctly outputs 4. Indeed it does. There are 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 people in line, like what I see here. Alrighty then, this is definitely not an empty queue, so if I ask it to log the isEmpty property of my queue class, false. It is not empty, right? It is not empty. Okay? Looking pretty good. So peek works just fine. It reported Luke correctly. Length seems to be just fine. IsEmpty seems to be just fine. So let's say that I have now let's go ahead and take a look at the front and rear properties to make sure those are working as we expected. The front is indeed still 0. That has not changed. And then the rear property of my class is 4 because it added Percival or enqueued him at the end of the line and then incremented that value by 1 to prepare for the next person adding in line. So the rear is indeed 4. Hence 4 minus 0, we got 4. So makes sense for our length back here, rather. So let's now say that after this has occurred, I have finished conducting my business at the bank, and I'm going to dequeue from the line, which should, once I console log this, should report me being done. So I can even make like a quick little phrase like that. This is a quick little string concatenation so we can see my name is done at the bank as an example here. And then we're going to ask it to console log the line.elements so we can see what has occurred here, okay? So here we go. I'm going to save this file, okay? So I have dequeued myself. Luke is done at the bank. And now we have our queue of 3 individuals left at the bank here, Audrey, Apollo, and Percival. So now we should hope to see that this dot front is no longer 0. Oh, because it's going to keep on console logging this every time I do it. Yeah, so now that we've seen that console log work, I'm just going to go ahead and remove that log because we don't need to see that every single time. There we go. Okay, yeah, so, I mean, the answer was correct anyway. I didn't want to see this console log of me leaving the bank every single time I save the file. But yeah, once I have dequeued, the front of the line is now 1, aka Audrey, but if I hit a peek method on that, it should report her name. Indeed it does. And looks like we're good to go. So let's go ahead and take a look at our rear property. Should still be 4 because no one got enqueued. Our length property of this queue should now be 3 and not 4 anymore. So this is going correctly so far. I'm going to go ahead and just clear this out real quick so we can start again. There we go. Just to have a clear window as I console log values here. Very good, very good. Looking good. So let's go ahead and dequeue 2 people. We'll say Audrey is also done at the bank. And if I save this file, the length should now be 2, so that's logging correctly. And if I hit it with a peek method to see who's at the front of the line, it should indeed be Apollo, which is correct. Let's say Apollo is now done with his job at the bank, whatever the cat's doing at the bank, depositing catnip or something like that. Peek it, there's Percival. And then if I dequeue Percival from the line here and I peek, it should return nothing or undefined because, yeah, nothing's there. And now we can hit it with a length to see what's going on. 0 is indeed correct, and our isEmpty should now prove to be true. So there we go. We have implemented... Oh, I can't talk. We have now implemented a queue data structure in JavaScript. Once again, this is a concept to know and understand in terms of... Remember, so FIFO is queue, stack is LIFO. If you kind of remember those two together, then you will be able to traverse a discussion of this in an interview, especially as an entry-level developer, if you're being tested on your knowledge of fundamentals. So make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe. Watch this playlist, which will be in the description below. Get involved in our community by checking out the links in the description as well. And I'll see y'all in the next video. We'll be tackling some other algorithm or data structure, obviously. So, yeah, bye. Bye-bye.